Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to give you all a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. So please consider becoming a regular contributor. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page, and figure out how it is that you can help us out there. Now, on the program today, as you can see from this very beautiful PowerPoint here, so obviously I did not do a lot of work putting together a really nice looking PowerPoint, but we're going to be talking about Steven Paulson's theology. And this is a program that I don't particularly want to do. I don't really want to be talking about this very much. However, it has been, in some of my published writings, I've dealt with Steven Paulson. And there has been some pushback against certain interpretations that I had of Steven Paulson's writings in some of those published materials. And I have been accused of misrepresenting him in various ways. So I recognize that some of my critics are my critics, and they're going to be my critics no matter what. And maybe it's just assuming too much in terms of good faith that people will watch or listen to this. But what I want to do here is just go through Steven Paulson's writings and talk about some of the key problems that I see in some of his writings in theology, and why he is a resource that is Lutheran or under the name Lutheran that I do not recommend. So for those of you who are not familiar with Steven Paulson, I could talk a little bit just about who he is and what his writings are. He was a professor at Luther Seminary in the ELCA. He was a student of Gerhard Forde. Gerhard Forde is the kind of figurehead of what he called radical Lutheranism. Radical Lutheranism is a particular movement within Lutheranism, really within the ELCA, that prioritizes justification kind of above all things, their own particularly unique version of the doctrine of justification. If you want to get information about Forde, radical Lutheranism, I just recently did a talk on Gerhard Forde, going through some quotes from his book, Where God Meets Man, if you want to see some of the things that I think are significant shifts away from a classical Lutheran theology, particularly with relation to the law and the atonement. So there are uniquenesses in Forde's theology that significantly differentiate him from confessional Lutheranism, or a Lutheranism that is defined by our confessional tradition that's more in line with the post-Reformation Lutheran churches. So Steven Paulson is not Forde, but Steven Paulson in many ways carries on Forde's legacy. He relies heavily on the work of Gerhard Forde. He was a student of Gerhard Forde, also taught at Luther Seminary and also in the ELCA, also publishes largely with Lutheran Quarterly, a publication that Gerhard Forde's inaugural essay on radical Lutheranism was published in their first issue. So there's significant overlap between these two thinkers. That doesn't mean that they're identical. It doesn't mean everything that Forde says, Paulson agrees with. There are places of difference between the two thinkers. And sometimes I've been accused of reading Forde's ideas into Paulson. So I want to talk about what Paulson himself actually said. Now, you may be familiar with Steven Paulson from his work with 1517. I am often asked about my views of 1517. I don't think it is... I've purposefully tried not to say too much. Something about, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all, so I don't. But I will say, I think it's pretty clear from anyone who pays attention to both 1517 and myself and what I do and what Just and Sinner does as a whole, so that's not just me, but that's everybody that's kind of been involved with the work that we do, we have a very different take on what Lutheran identity is, and what Lutheranism is, and what Lutheranism should be. Very, very different. There's not really a way to reconcile the two. I think we have completely different visions. A number of people associated with 1517 have called me a heretic on numerous occasions, which, in published form, which is fine, whatever. But so it shouldn't be surprising that there's a difference theologically between us on some significant issues. But Steven Paulson has been associated with them. I don't want to get into personal things at all. That's not really the point of all of this. This is just to deal with the theological issues So what I really want to just be dealing with is the question of, well, is the theology that Paulson promotes in his book Lutheran Theology, in his volumes The Outlaw God, is that something that is beneficial to Lutherans or to the church broadly, or are there significant things to, at the very least, be concerned about? Now, Paulson was featured recently in a publication of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which was the Large Catechism, the new edition of the Large Catechism, which had a number of essays from various authors explaining parts of the Catechism. Paulson had an essay on the Sabbath, and that caused a bit of pushback. People are saying, should we have Paulson in LCMS writings? I'm not in the LCMS, so I don't, I wouldn't have put him in the book, and I said that before when I did an interview in Issues, Etc. about this, but to some extent, it's like kind of not, it's not my synod, and I'm not part of that publishing house. I wouldn't publish him in my publishing house. But there are significant, I think, theological issues there. So what I'm going to do is go through some of Paulson's writings and talk about what I think are some of the things to watch out for. If you like Paulson, I think these are things they should at least be concerned about, or at least kind of think through as you're reading his writings. If you find him beneficial for whatever reason, just I want you to think carefully about some of the things that are being said. Now, a couple quick points to mention before I start going through this. One is, every time I talk about Paulson, I am told that I misrepresent him. There have been times recently where I have given direct quotes from Paulson. The person didn't realize it was a direct quote, and the person said, "You're totally misrepresenting him. He doesn't believe that at all." And I say, "This is actually a quote from Paulson," and this happened on more than one occasion. And the response is usually, "Well, he didn't really mean that." And look, I don't know what he really means. All I can do is read what somebody has published. I don't know anything about the man personally. I don't know anything about his piety or his personality or what he really means by things. All I can do is deal with somebody's published work. That's what you do when you publish books, especially in the realm of theology, just like any academic field. All I can do is judge you on what you've written. And at the very least, there needs to be a lot more clarification of a lot of points that are very obscure. I've read just about everything the guy's written. I have tried to read in the most charitable way I possibly can, but I also need to read honestly. And the things that he says, I'm kind of taking him at face value that he means what he says. And these are not things that are said one time or twice. These are things that are said over and over and over and over and over again over many years at many different publications and articles and journals and books and all sorts of other places. All right. So I'm going to go through what some of the issues are that I think are particular problems that are here in his writings. And basically what I've done is I've just put together a series of slides that are just quotes from his works. So most of these are from Lutheran Theology and the Outlaw God, Volume 1. I have numerous quotes on all of these various points in order to demonstrate that this is not just kind of a one-off thing, that these things do not show up just in one place or two places. I have like a huge folder set of files on each of these points categorized into the different ideas that you find here. Now, if you have watched the program in Gerhard Forde, that's probably helpful to start with because that lays out some of the groundwork, and I don't want to repeat all of that. But Gerhard Forde basically starts his system with a rejection of the Lutheran Orthodox doctrine of God's eternal law. And this is really kind of the key difference. And Forde sees this as the key difference between his system and the Lutheran Orthodox system. That in the classical Lutheran Orthodoxy, the law is defined as eternal. We have a lex aeterna. I have a book in that title dealing with these thinkers. Lex aeterna being an eternal law. That the law is something that is eternal. The law is a reflection of God's own moral nature. And so it is eternal as God himself is eternal. The law is a reflection of who God is. The law is not arbitrary. The law is not just a set of standards that go away. The law is not temporalized. And that means that in a classical Lutheran view of atonement, the law has to be fulfilled in order for us to be saved, because that's God's own nature. So there has to be the active obedience of Christ under the law, and Jesus has to satisfy the demands of the law through his death. So you have the active and passive obedience of Christ that are necessary in order for the law to be fulfilled on our behalf. So in order to be justified, the law actually needs to be fulfilled, but it's fulfilled by Christ. This is what Gerhard Forde rejects as what he calls the latter scheme. And Paulson rejects this too, as we see, but he's going to use different language to talk about it rather than the latter scheme. But also, along with that, then, if the law is eternal, that means it's also the eternal moral standard, which means that we have a third function of the law, or third use of the law, so that the law is also the moral guide that we need throughout our lives. In other words, Christians are called to actually be obedient by the power of the Holy Spirit. Through the work of Christ, through the gospel, we are to be obedient to the law, and that is an element of sanctification in the Christian life. So many of the differences are, about God and his relationship to his will and his law, how the law and gospel relates, how the atonement functions, and Christian obedience. All of that is essentially related to this one question, which is the law eternal or is it not? And Furedy sets aside Lutheran orthodoxy and his own system and says, Lutheran orthodoxy says it is eternal, and Furedy says, I'm saying it's not. That's where you have the two very different systems. And this is where I say, I don't think the system of Lutheranism that is promoted by Justin Sinner and that which is promoted by 1517 are really compatible, because they are coming from fundamentally different perspectives. They have a very different interpretation of what Lutheran theology and Christian theology in general really is supposed to be. So here I have just some quotes. This is from his Lutheran Theology. And Paulson is giving a very similar critique here, very much echoing what Furedy says about Lutheran orthodoxy. He says, in order to defend the necessity of the chief article of justification by faith alone, they, meaning the Lutheran Orthodox, had recourse to the eternal law and sought an ultimate unity of law and gospel that would enable this order of salvation to be accomplished. And then he cites David Hollatz, who's one of my favorite authors, 1648 to 1713, the last of kind of the great Lutheran Orthodox writers of that era of the church, where he says the law and the gospel are practically united as if in a certain mathematical point. They concur in producing, 1, repentance of the sinner, 2, the renovation of the justified person, and 3, the preservation of the renewed man. Now I'm like, maybe should have taken clearer pictures of this here. But what he's talking about here, Hollatz is saying that there is a unity in law and gospel. What Hollatz is not saying, if you read Hollatz, he's not saying the law and gospel are identical, but he's saying that they have the same telos. They have the same end. And Paulson is saying it's wrong to say that the law and the gospel have the same telos, or that they practically are united and work together toward the same ends. As we're going to see, Paulson sees the law and the gospel as inherently contradictory. He's even going to say that in the law and the gospel, God contradicts himself. He says it blatantly, not just once, but over and 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 over again. Okay, another quote from the same book. He says, in particular, the leading Lutheran teachers of the 17th century concentrated upon demonstrating logically that God's justification of the ungodly does not make God capricious, arbitrary, and therefore untrustworthy. But instead of fidelity to the promise in Christ, God's trustworthiness was fastened to the eternal objective order of the world provided by God's law. This is an echo of the whole ladder scheme argument of Furedy. And the argument is essentially that the Lutheran Orthodox believed that God could not be capricious or arbitrary, in that God's justice actually had to be satisfied. God's law actually had to be satisfied, which is just a classic Anselmian approach to the atonement, but it's a classical Christian approach to God's law, rather than a voluntarist approach. So the perspective that Paulson, and he's drawing from Furedy here, takes is a voluntarist approach. A voluntarist approach to the law essentially says that God freely gives a law, but is not bound to actually morally act in accordance with that law. So there's a divorce between the law and God. And it's a summary of the voluntarist position. It essentially says that the law could be other than it is. So God could have, for example, commanded that lying was acceptable, that lying was a morally good action. God didn't do that, but he could have. Whereas in a more classical essentialist approach, we would say that God couldn't have determined that lying was sinful, because the very reason why lying is sinful is because God doesn't lie, so it's opposed to God. So you see this difference. How this works out in the atonement, then, is that, well, God, in a radical Lutheran approach, this is what Paulson's articulating here, is that God can act outside of the bounds of his law. This is why his whole series is called the Outlaw God. God works without the law, apart from the law. And so God does not need the requirements of his just law to be met in order to forgive. God can just abrogate the law altogether. So it cuts the groundwork out from the necessity of the obedience, whether active or passive, of Christ. And gets really at the heart of what the Christian message is about, because it gets to the heart of the cross and what the cross is actually doing. I have some other quotes here. He says, this is on this topic still, Lutheran orthodoxy and the law, from the same book. So many fearful questions emerge, in fact, that the history of Lutheranism, so he's divorcing himself from historic Lutheranism, has become the story of attempts to bring the law back into the Christian life, like the little Dutch boy trying to point his finger in the leaking dike. So there's an approach to Lutheranism that we see in Paulson here, which is essentially a rejection of the history of the Lutheran Church, which says that you see a lot of kind of disdain for pre-Luther, the church pre-Luther, a lot of rejection of Augustine and the church fathers. And Luther comes as this kind of Archimedean point of theology, this height of all theology. And after Luther, then you have Lutheran orthodoxy, which is seen as the kind of post-Reformation church is this kind of continual downgrade from Luther. So Luther is really this isolated figure, and the history of Lutheranism is then this history because of their view of the law, which again centers on their view of the atonement, is, Paulson says, is mistaken. A continual attempt to raise back up God's law. So the version of Lutheranism you find in Paulson is one of radical discontinuity between Luther and Lutheranism. It's very much a Luther versus the Lutherans mentality that you find in, like the Calvin versus the Calvinist debate. So I fundamentally reject that. I think it's a very un-Catholic approach to Lutheranism that isolates Luther and divorces him from, really the entirety of the Christian tradition, but before and after Luther. And kind of the entire purpose of Justin Center as an organization is to promote Lutheran orthodoxy, right? This is why we exist. It's what we're doing. We promote that Lutheran orthodoxy and what it has to say to the world and our culture and to theology and philosophy and all different areas of life. But all of that is founded upon the basic assumptions of the 17th century Lutheran Church. A couple other things to mention on this point. Here's just an example of some of the ways that Paulson talks. He says, Christian faith is not moving toward virtue, it is taking leave of it. So he speaks against virtue ethics, this kind of just total radical discontinuity between justification and virtue, or Christianity and any classical philosophy at all, where, and this is just a unanimous agreement of the fathers, right? There's not much unanimous agreement on the fathers on much. There are plenty of places where if you read the church fathers, they disagree. There's no debate that virtue is good, okay? Like there's not a debate that whether is virtue a good thing or a bad thing. No, virtue is good. This comes from 2 Peter, by the way, says to add virtue to your faith. This is biblical. And you see this kind of language repeated in Paulson. Virtue is bad. We move away from virtue because virtue is kind of legalism. The gospel destroys everything we see as good and beautiful. There's really a disdain for beauty. We'll see a disdain for any idea of the beatific vision, really cutting off the essential elements of classical Christianity that are anyway in continuity with classical thought. These just got this kind of radical discontinuity between any classical thought and the gospel. Okay, so then he says, again about virtue, he says, Christ is to be imitated, but only after virtue is ended. Taking leave of virtue and going to Christ is apocalyptic. It is a new life outside the legal scheme, without law at all. It means to have a new life outside oneself who is dead. And there's more to say to this. But this rhetoric is very common in Paulson's writings. So actually, Christianity is not about striving for virtue. It's about virtue ending and living without the law at all. Clearly a rejection of the third function or use of the law. There is a kind of relational ontology underneath this, that we don't live in ourselves, we live in Christ. We have a life that is outside of us, which rhetorically Luther uses some language like that, but they do far too much with it. Okay, a lot more I could say. I'm trying to go through these points. I have a ton of these here, so we won't be able to get to all of it. This is another point where I think that there is just a very obvious divergence between... Sorry, my phone is going off here. I'm turning the sound off. there's a very strong divergence between just what Scripture says about something like the doctrine of election and Paulson's system. Now, one of the criticisms that I have made of Paulson, and this is something that I have said in numerous places, but one of the criticisms that I've made of, and I think this is true of a lot of modern theology, that there is this focus on the event of revelation that I have with my encounter with God. Everything is known in terms of event between me and the preacher. This is very Rudolf Bultmann. This shows up very much in Karl Barth. This shows up in all sorts of thinkers, especially in the 20th century. And a lack of discussion of revelation as something that's objective, because revelation is this encounter. And so the law and the gospel are redefined for Ferde, and then Paulson follows him in many ways, as these kind of existential encounters. So God encounters us with his wrath, that's law. The law is what it does to us. Okay, so Ferde denies that there's a distinction between the office of the law and the essence of the law. He says the essence is the office. What he means by that is accusation is the essence of the law. Freedom from accusation is the essence of the gospel. That's Ferde. But Paulson follows him in many ways in that everything is defined by event, particularly the event that occurs through kerygma, so through the preacher. So you'll see this over and over again, the language of the preacher. So one place where I find this is particularly clearly just divergent from Scripture and divergent from what classical Christian theology says is in his doctrine of election. Now, I've been challenged on this. Some say that he doesn't really mean that election is not eternal, that election actually isn't what the preacher says. I'm just going to read these quotes. And I've looked through his writings to find somewhere where he talks about election being eternal. Every time he mentions eternal election outside of time, it's in a negative sense that I can find anyway. It doesn't mean I haven't missed something, but at least as far as I can find. So this is what he says. He says, preachers do not come with information about an election done elsewhere outside of time. Preachers actually do the electing here and now, in the present, as Christ did for the thief on the cross. Today you will be with me in paradise. So what he's saying here is that election is not something that's done in eternity past, like Ephesians 1 blatantly says. Instead, election is what the preacher does, because everything is conflated with the for you speech act. So all of theology for Paulson was kind of squished into this one momentary speech act where the preacher proclaims, I forgive you, you are forgiven. And in that speech act is contained really the entirety of all Christian theology. So election it's too abstract to talk about this eternity past. So election is actually not that. The preacher is talking about an election done elsewhere, as Paul, the preacher, seems to do in Ephesians chapter 1 to the Ephesians. Instead, he says that it's actually something that happens now. The preacher elects. Okay, so then he says here, again, preaching is God's predestination. Okay, that's what he says. He doesn't say preaching brings about the effect of God's predestination. God's predestination works itself out in time through preaching. He just says preaching is God's predestination. And this kind of language shows up over and over again. Okay, so then this is from Luther's Outlaw God here. He says, if the law theoretically elects, and he calls everything the law, by the way. So when he's talking about the law, he often uses the law as a stand-in for anything that's kind of objective and eternal. And this is what's very confusing about his writings, and I've heard this from a lot of people. They say, what does he even mean by what he's talking about? Because this has nothing to do with the law at all. But he's equating this notion of a static, kind of immutable law with the immutable goodness of God outside of time. All of this for Paulson is law. So he says, if the law theoretically elects, it means it was somehow done eternally, outside of time, in a perfect hidden world that is presumed to exist in order to protect God from evil and retain the choices of good and evil as clear objects for human realization. I made these way too small to read here. Okay, but this is so clearly, I mean, here's an instance where he's explicitly saying it's not this thing that occurs outside of time. Okay, so here is just a clear place where Scripture just blatantly has so much text about a predestination that occurs outside of time in the Formula of Concord does, or Lutheran Confessions, the entire history of the church, whether you come to, an intuitu fidei conclusion, or Arminian or Calvinist, or whatever position you have, pretty much everyone's agreed that there is an eternal act of election, however you want to work this out, because Scripture just blatantly says it. So here's an instance that I think is just really obvious of Paulson departing from the clear text of Scripture. And what's so frustrating about Paulson's writing is there's no attempt to do exegesis of the text. There's no attempt to kind of interact with it and say, well, here's how I interpret the text. Here's why I think some interpreters or commentators are wrong on this. They're just these statements, one after another, just assertive statements that are, this is true, and if you don't believe this, you're, a pietistic legalist. He's always got these clever ways of, he's more clever than just saying those things, but that's kind of followers of Paulson to do that. Rhetorically, he's very good, right? He's a good rhetorician, so he does have kind of clever ways of dismissing people or make people sound legalistic or wrong. But there's no in-depth, what does the text say? I don't even know how he deals with Ephesians 1. Okay, so I want to read some other statements, then we're moving on to the subject of metaphysics. I know we're bouncing all over the place here. This is a lot. If you don't know Paulson, you're probably not following very well. I think the Ferdy program will help because that sets the basic groundwork, so you can probably follow this a lot better because we're kind of following on some of those points. And I wanted to get through this material, so it's kind of required probably to even make much sense of this. All right. Against metaphysics. So something else you see in Paulson's theology is, this is true about Ferdy as well, this is true about Oswald Bayer, a lot of people kind of in the same-ish circles, is he does not like classical philosophy. And we see that in his rejection of virtue, but he's clearer in a lot of the things he says here. He says, the scholastic Orthodox Lutherans of the 17th century, against whom these new Lutherans are speaking, fell into the problem with technical distinctions they introduced into justification. So he's dismissing Lutheran orthodoxy, Lutheran scholasticism. So he's rejecting fine distinctions in theology. So this is the one he's talking about. Like the two energies of faith, whether passive and active, one receiving Christ's merit, the other the power to love. This is the distinction I use all the time. So I use it in my preaching. I have a book called Hands of Faith, which is exactly this. It's based on this. All right. The sturdy theologians in the century following Luther fell into the temptation of the great teacher Melanchthon. So here is where you see the downgrade of Lutheranism starts with Melanchthon. I mean, we're talking, there's Luther and then there's Melanchthon, and everybody kind of follows Melanchthon down this path. Werner Ehlert does this a little bit. He says Melanchthon kind of caved to Calvin, and this idea of the theories of the law. So it's very like Luther versus Melanchthon, and that becomes Luther versus the rest of the Lutherans coming after. Okay, the problem is they're allowing themselves to be drawn back into the legal scheme. And so the ladder theology we talked about in the Ferdy program, the ladder scheme, ladder theology doesn't show up in Paulson's writings, but legal scheme does. And legal scheme seems very similar in how Paulson defines it to what Ferdy talks about with ladder theology. So back into the legal scheme in terms of Aristotle's categories of cause and effect. So language of cause and effect in theology, which is kind of language that everyone's used forever. But I would make an argument that you can't not have a definition of cause and effect. Like, you can't avoid this. So you either end up with the classical view, or you end up as a Humean, which I think he does, is in following David Hume, views of cause and effect. So whether one makes faith a cause of justification or an effect of it, the heart of Christ and the preacher's word are moved that only a carcass remains. Why? I guess these are the kinds of statements defend that. Okay, why is that the case? What is so damaging about using causal language in relation to faith and justification? Sometimes I see this thrown out and I don't know if Paulson gets this specific. I know Karl Broughton does, who's not a radical Lutheran, but Broughton criticizes, for example, the Lutheran Orthodox here and saying, well, if you say faith is a cause of justification, that means that you're saying that basically you're justified based on the merit or goodness of your faith. Now, I can understand why someone would come to that conclusion, but if you read the Lutheran Orthodox, they have very fine distinctions where they would say that faith is the instrumental cause. In other words, it's the instrument that receives justification, is what they're saying. So you have to interpret, causality in the way that the Lutheran Orthodox themselves define causality, in some other way. But he doesn't. He just makes these kinds of statements. But I need to know why. What is so? I know you think Aristotle's bad and virtue's bad and language of causality is bad, but why? These things are never. These kinds of things are just thrown out as these bold, universalizing statements, but they're not really defended. Now, here's another example of a great universalizing statement that is just complete nonsense, where he says this. He says, Lutherans, he's making a categorical statement here. Lutherans do not spend time on proofs of God's existence. Oh? Lutherans don't? According to who? This is what drives me crazy. What are you defining as what Lutherans are? Whatever you decide? So, Lutherans have historically spent a lot of time on arguments for God's existence. Gerhard says a heck of a lot about it. Melanchthon says a heck of a lot about it. You can read, Milton Valentine who's an American Lutheran, 19th century author, has numerous apologetics volumes. He's got a volume in Ethics defending the existence of God, but then on one's proofs of God's existence. Now, I disagree with Valentine on some things, but he's a Lutheran, and there's tons of these. Lutherans have, for the most part of the history of Lutheranism, have made arguments for the existence of God in one way or another. Now, Paulson can say, I don't think that we should waste time on arguments for the existence of God. And he can defend his reasons why he doesn't think that's worthwhile. That's fine. You can make that argument. What you can't do in an honest way is just say, Lutherans don't do this. What do you mean Lutherans don't do this? Of course Lutherans do this all the time. You could say you think they're wrong in it, or not all Lutherans do it, but just to make these universalizing statements this is why this stuff bugs me so much. This is why I'm so devoted to these issues and care so much, because he makes these statements that are so universalizing about the entirety of my tradition that I love. And they're just wrong. And really divorce Lutheranism from all classical thought and really any place in any kind of coherent philosophical conversation. Okay. So here is another universalizing statement. This is great. He says, abstraction from created life has always been the problem Lutheran theology has with metaphysics or ontology. Here he's just saying, he's making this is a blatant historical falsehood. Because he's not just saying I, or my group of Lutherans. He says Lutherans have always had a problem with ontology and metaphysics. There's no footnote defining this or defending this or saying what trace of line of thought totally rejects ontology and metaphysics. It's just not true. You have metaphysics in our confessions. Article 1 of the Formula of Concord in the Flacian Controversy defends Aristotle's distinctions between substance and accidents, saying that no intelligent human being doubts these things. And you read Martin Chemnitz in The Two Natures of Christ. He extensively discusses and explains the nature of the Aristotle's distinctions and essence language distinction between, ousia, hypostases, language that's in our creeds, by the way. So you can't dismiss metaphysics and hold to the creeds in reality because they're metaphysical. They're using metaphysical terms and making metaphysical statements. But this just isn't true even within, he's writing in the ELCA. Robert Jensen writes tons on metaphysics. Wolfhard Pannenberg writes on metaphysics. No, I don't agree with their metaphysic because they're much more Hegelian and I'm much more of a kind of Neoplatonic in my view of metaphysics, but they don't reject metaphysics. So what line of Lutherans is he using to define what all Lutherans do or don't think? All right. And then he says, another great universalizing statement after this. The reasons Lutherans do not rightly produce a new ethics is that they remove teleology, the striving after the good, and in its place is the teaching of suffering. So he's making a very bold statement. He's saying Lutherans don't do metaphysics, which is wrong, It's just not true. It's a blatant falsehood. Lutherans, now he's saying Lutherans don't do ethics? Lutherans don't do ethics. I mean, this is so blatantly false. Like, I don't know what else to say about this, but Lutherans have produced ethical volumes forever. I mean, our publishing house has a whole series that we're going to be putting out on Lutheran volumes on ethics. We have Adolf von Harless's lengthy volume. I mean, it's a massive volume on ethics. Even Immanuel Kant, like the most important ethicist in the Enlightenment era, was very much influenced by his pietist Lutheran upbringing and his own ethical formulations. Now, I'm not saying that I love Kant and he's an Orthodox Lutheran, but some of the impetus there was from his Lutheran upbringing. Pietists certainly talked a heck of a lot about ethics, but it's not just the pietists. Johann Gerhard wrote tons about ethical issues. You have Harless, you have Hans Martensen has like 4 volumes on ethics, which is extensive. You've got plenty of Lutheran ethical writing today. Gilbert Meilander, wonderful Lutheran virtue ethicist. You have Joel Bierman's work dealing with ethics. And along with ethics, he's also saying Lutherans reject teleology. Christians don't reject teleology. Teleology is that there is an end or a goal to things that we do in the way that the universe is created because God exists. All things are from him and to him, what we call final causes. That's just being a Christian. Like, that's not even just a uniquely Lutheran thing. That's just being a Christian. If there is no teleology, you are a secular Enlightenment naturalist. And somehow to say, well, we don't have teleology, we have suffering, as if suffering has nothing to do with teleology. Like, these are not even, why are these even opposites? Like, they're not even in the same category. The question of whether God uses suffering has nothing to do with whether there's teleology. Like, it's like, I don't like the color blue because I like squares. It's that, like, totally disconnected. Like, what does this even mean? I get passionate, can you tell? All right. So then he says, Luther's way of speaking offends the first law of thinking, the Aristotelian rule of non-contradiction, so that a thing cannot be one thing and another at once. There we go, guys. And you reject Aristotle's... There is, if you really believe this, you have no coherent place of even making an argument. You really believe that Aristotle's law of non-contradiction is wrong. That Luther literally says and believes, as Lutherans, we believe that we don't believe in the law of non-contradiction. All right, well, everyone doing your classical education, get rid of your logic classes, Lutheran classical education. We don't need it. Too much ethics. Stop teaching your kids ethics. Stop telling them, logical fallacies. Like, this is all opposed to the gospel. So he says this specifically when he goes through this issue of God's law and his gospel, and specifically God contradicting himself. And he's using this as an argument to say God contradicts himself, and if God contradicts himself, that means we have to reject Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. All right. One final quote on this. He says, even though it is only the simple gospel word, God's promise changes everything in the most radical way from death to life regarding thought, metaphysics, being is not just moving from essence to existence. It is the end of both. Okay. In the gospel, we just have the end of existence and essence. Like he's rejecting the entirety of all philosophical discourse for centuries and just saying, it's nonsense. You just throw it away with the gospel without any real argumentation about what any of this means, or it's not even footnoted. So, I'm not convinced by the things I've read by Paulson on this that he knows what essence means or what classical metaphysics teaches. I'm really not. And that's my being generous, because if he does, then he's purposefully being completely misrepresentative. But to say that there is an end, like the question of how essence relates to existence, you cannot just dismiss it. You can't just dismiss the fact that things exist. And I know he's talking about the existentialist, who's basically saying that all classical philosophy is wrong and also all existential philosophy is wrong. But there's not even really a coherent reason or solution to it. Here, this one, this is great here. Oh my gosh. He says this on the beatific vision. So the beatific vision being, this is our goal in Christianity. The goal is union with God. We are before the face of God. We are transformed by God's glory. We are glorified as we stand in his presence in eternity, which Gerhard has a ton to say about this. Augustine has a ton to say about this. This is just Christian. The final end of humans for Paulson. The final end. Hey, end, does he mean telos? I thought there wasn't such a thing. Is opposite our desire for elevation by superior virtue. And so opposes the supernatural transcending to the vision of God that participates in God's essence. There is no beatific vision in the end. This is pure nihilistic, utter nonsense. It's nonsense. I mean, he's trying to destroy the entire essence of Christianity. I'm sorry, that's blunt, but it's true. I am a Christian because I want God in the end. I want union with God. I am a wretched sinner and I need forgiveness and I need Christ to get there, but that is what I want. I want the bliss of being united with my God and Savior for eternity. That's the entire reason I'm a Christian. To tell me there's none of that, there's no beatific vision in the end, might as well read Nietzsche. Okay, we're going to now look at the law of God. So the law, so when we're talking about the question of why does the law not save? Well, classical theology is going to come up with a very different answer to what Paulson gives here. Classical Christian theology is going to say that the law doesn't save because I cannot live up to the law. The law demands obedience from me. We would say the law demands perfection. Sorry, new perspective, guys. The law demands perfection. I cannot obey. I am a sinner. Therefore, the law cannot save me, and I need redemption. I need forgiveness. I need a substitute. I need grace. I need Christ is what I need. And so why does the law not save? Because I'm a sinner. Or why is the law, why does the law not do good for me? Because I'm a sinner, not because the law is bad or something. But the answer that Paulson gives is actually pretty similar to the answer a lot of the New Perspective guys are going to give, which is that the law doesn't save because the law isn't Jesus. So he says, the wrath of God is against our hearts, and there is no escape from the wrath by using this law. Even when judges are right to accuse others of wickedness, they reveal their own hearts are in the law, and the law is simply not Christ. So he uses this illustration of if a judge is judging someone wicked by the law, which is their job and they're supposed to, that's still them being law-minded. In other words, God doesn't judge. God is not like that. He doesn't use a law mindset. He just ignores law because he does something outside of law altogether, which means there's no vicarious atonement. There's no active obedience of Christ. He calls this the legal scheme. Okay, so here again, as the legal scheme is kind of the stand-in for what Ferdy says is the latter scheme. He says the legal scheme cannot grasp the extent of Christ's forgiveness, which is the point of all of Jesus's parables. First of all, that's not true that that's the point of all of Jesus' parables. But these universalizing statements. Of course, Jesus has plenty of parables to talk about forgiveness, but I don't know any New Testament scholar that is an expert in the parables that would try to say literally every parable is about forgiveness. It's just not true. But okay, his forgiveness not only fulfills the law, but breaks it open like new wine in old wineskins, spilling out onto new ground without any law to guide or limit its effluence. So he's saying that Jesus doesn't need to fulfill the law. That's what he's rejecting. It's something totally apart from the law at all. Here are some statements of his against vicarious satisfaction, in case any of this wasn't clear enough, because again, people tell me I misrepresent him when I say this. I mean, these are just his words. I don't know how you get around what he says. And if he doesn't mean what he says, that's his problem, not mine. Okay, he says unsuccessful theories of atonement. So he's talking about Lutheran Orthodox, that brought Christ's work on the cross under the confines of the law. So he's saying that these are vicarious satisfaction. Jesus satisfies the demands of the law. He's saying that these are unsuccessful theories of atonement. And then he goes further. And this is the entire Anselmian tradition, which is not just Anselm, by the way. I mean, this goes back to Athanasius. He says, according to the legal scheme, sin is either a lack or a debt that must be compensated before the law can be satisfied, fulfilled, or sin is a crime that must be punished. When Christ himself is pushed into the legal scheme, its practitioners demand Christ make payment for debt, absorb punishment, provide compensation to those deprived of their goods, like the devil, the law, or even God himself, if he's going to serve as a true mediator between God and sinners. Theories of atonement developed as a means of making the cross of Christ fit into this legal scheme. So he's saying that's bad. So he's rejecting, he's not just rejecting, the kind of propitiation-focused kind of reformed atonement model, which is very much satisfying the wrath of God, which tends to be the focus of more reformed presentations. Whereas Lutheran presentations tend to focus on that more satisfaction of the demands of the divine law. He's not like adopting one for the other. He's saying that's all entirely wrong. Any notion of any satisfaction of divine law at all is wrong in atonement models. Okay. So what exactly does Jesus do? And here's where he tries to take away what he calls abstraction and make it concrete. That Jesus just literally dies under the law. Because everything is just about concretion, nothing abstract at all. So he says, for my sins become Christ, because contrary to all Gnostic suspicion, oh, there we go, you're a Gnostic. Thanks, James Lindsay. He actually historically, physically took them in his body. Physically. Like then he goes on to say, sins are not ideas or abstract generalities or debts recorded in some spiritual accounting book. And then this is what he says. Sins are taken by Christ bodily in order to catch you in the act of betraying him and literally to take your sin from his own body. So it's hard to piece all of this together. And I've read this section so many times, but from what I can gather together, what he's trying, and I've read a bunch of his stuff on the atonement, it's vague. And this was a criticism I saw. It was like, well, Paulson might not say that because Paulson's very vague. Why are you vague about the atonement? Like, this is not, like, it's not a virtue in theology to be vague, especially about central issues, right? Like, what good are you doing by being vague here? So he's rejecting vicarious satisfaction. That's clear. But he says he wants something concrete. So it's Jesus catches you in the act of betraying him. So it's this idea that all of our sins put Christ on the cross, where we all betrayed him. This is very Ferdy as well. We all betray him. And in killing him, those who betrayed and killed him, that is literally sin. So sin is literally killing Jesus. So it seems to be that the sin is the actual betrayal of Jesus. So he catches you in your sin, in that literally it's sin that kills him because it's sinful actions that put Jesus to death. That's as best I can take it here. Oh man, there's plenty more here that I could talk about. Okay. Let's see. You can read some of these yourself if you want to look at a couple of these. He says, he criticizes Anselm here, so maybe this is just clear. He says, Anselm is the first of the scholastics, or what Luther calls the lying sophists, not because of the early date of his birth, but because he made theology into a logical deduction from the single principle that God is the law and the law is God. And that essentially is his projection of the satisfaction theory. I'm not going to get into his interpretation of Luther or particular Luther quotes, because that would be kind of beside the point. He very much pits law against gospel. This happens all over the place. I just have a couple quotes here. He says, rather, evil must be understood in relation both to the law and the gospel, two very different words. These words are not timeless. Okay, so there's no focus on the kind of theological objective generalities. Everything is concrete here and now. But precisely timely, striking the heart through the ear. The arrival of the gospel depends utterly on a preacher, not on a logical deduction. Reason tries to explain evil to preserve the overall system, but faith directly overcomes it. Now, But it's probably not that clear actually from that particular quote. So let me look at some of these other quotes that are a little more clear on his rejection of the law here. Okay, what I'm going to do is expand this on my screen so I can actually read some of these because they're hard for me to read. So my face is going to be a little smaller here. Okay, he says, the law is exactly right, but only about living people. Sin is not reckoned where there is no law, and the law cannot reckon sin on dead people. There the judgment has already been made. There is no more work for the law to do, since that would be kicking of a dead horse. Death is the limit of the law, and so at death, the law itself is shown to be limited, not eternal. That's the idea that I'm trying to get at here. So the law is not eternal in terms of its applicable authority or use. So there are times where he kind of hedges these notions that the law is not eternal, and there are points in his writings, I want to be fair here, where he does seem to say that there's kind of some sense in which maybe the law is eternal. I never see a full kind of detailed explanation of exactly what that means. But here's the second quote is really key. He says, obedience to the Father and obedience to the law are two different things. So he's saying that obedience to God is not obedience to the law, because God is not the law. The law is not the moral nature of God. That's a radical divorce of the law and God. So he says, when Christ is obedient to the Father, it is not merely a synonym of obedience to the law. I mean, this is the entire basis of the classical Lutheran approach that says that the law requires perfection. Why does the law require perfection? Because the law reflects the moral will of God, and God is perfect. So not to measure up to the law is not to measure up to the nature of God, and that's why God has judgment toward us, because we can't measure up to his perfect law, which is identical with his essence. So the law is totally divorced from its classical context here. He says, when God and law are distinguished, God is the subject and the law is his instrument to use. This is why everything is kind of, as again, I said, concrete. God uses the law. He does the law, but he is not the law. So he does the law as an act of condemnation or judgment. When God and law are distinguished, okay, both Jews and Gentiles have much invested in making law and God synonymous. For then loving law is none other than loving God, and doing the law is none other than becoming united with God. So he's saying that loving the law is not loving God. I don't know how you square that with Psalm 119, but that's what he says. Okay, then here from the Outlaw God, he says, God acted outside the law by ignoring the law's founding assumption of human free choices of will. Now, he has all this tie between the law and free will, and the law assumes free will, but God ignores that. So part of his rhetoric in this particular book, the volume 1 especially, but it shows up in the other volumes as well, that there is an assumption in the law of free will. So in Luther's Bondage of the Will, when he's rejecting, this human freedom not to sin apart from grace, that therefore he's rejecting the law. So I fundamentally disagree with those two things being tied together. But the important point here is that he's saying God acts outside the law. He's constantly talking about God acting outside the law. Okay, I'm just going to move to this one. Okay, let's see. He says, after all, the human will is bound by one intractable desire, that God not only use the law to judge, but be the law in his essence. So that's what this bound will wants. So the essence of sin, right, is in the essence of the bound will, because classically the essence of the bound will is, I am a sinner, and my will is bound so that I love sin and I don't obey God. I don't obey God's law by nature. I obey my sinful desires. But he's defining sin as sin itself is the desire to say that the law's essence is God. So in my theological defense, when I write the books that I do defending classical theism, that is the very essence of sin, is me defining God as his law. That's the essence of sin. It's so bizarre. So, okay. All right. Let's see. A couple quick quotes here. He says, Luther's theology is steeped out of those confines because he fell upon the difference between God and the law. Okay. And then he says this. Learning this difference between God and the law is the beginning of all wisdom and is the true fear of God. That's what the author of Proverbs was certainly saying. So you see how bold his statements are. It's like, don't tell me I'm overreacting. These are bold statements. You see, so he's saying, but before this, he says, the essence of all sin is the mission of just and sinner. That really is the case. Okay, so don't bug me about taking this stuff on, all right? Because I know some people are going to say, but, inter-Lutheran debates are bad. And no, like this difference that I have with Paulson is far greater than the difference that I have with, say, the Eastern Orthodox when I'm dealing with the Filioque. Like, it's not even on the same level. Okay, let's see. For now, we observe that God is wrongly conceived by means of the law as the most external, transcendental, beautiful, holy other thing possible when compared with humans. That's wrong, he says. What? It's looking at God through the law, wrongly conceiving of God in this way. All right, let's look at, this stuff is great. God contradicts himself. Okay. Now, people tell me, Paulson doesn't really mean this when he says this. You're just reading things into his thought that he doesn't really say. Let me just read these. Tell me what you think. And remember, in this context is where Paulson also says he doesn't believe in the law of non-contradiction, okay? Like, I don't know how... He could say, like, the most horrendous thing, word for word, and I cite it, and people just say, you're misrepresenting him. Well, if it's that hard to represent him, apparently he can't represent himself either. So, all right, God contradicts himself. He says, God is the anti-existentialist. God is actually acting contrary to himself. Page 30 of that book. 31. A faith that fights against faith, from the God who opposes himself and speaks the one word in the universe where there is no law. Okay, God opposes himself. Then, free God is not just a divinity or on a lark outside of his law like an irrational tyrant or outlaw cowboy, but is God's opposition to his own law at the crucial moment of its final judgment in his Son. There is a great cosmic duel that is no less than God opposing himself that makes God an outlaw not only for himself but for us. Okay, next quote. Theology normally understands its task as putting together what has been separated so that God's mercy must be united with his justice. The work of theology is then to do what Parmenides taught, to find the unity and then predicate only logical names or attributes to this God. So he's saying that the attributes of God are not one. He's denying divine simplicity here. The work of theology is the opposite of that. Okay. However, one way or another, these opposing attributes are fit together, again, this is clear, in perfect simplicity, saying this is wrong, within the generous ordering of the eternal law. So, the normal course of theology, as perfected by Thomas, teaches us how to deal with the paradox of God's hiddenness through this method of union. He's saying there is no divine simplicity. The route that takes you to divine simplicity, he says, is wrong. You can think that with Paulson. You certainly are not a Lutheran. If the Augsburg Confession is what defines Lutherans. Divine simplicity is confessed, Article 1, first thing of the Augsburg Confession. Okay. Another quote, what is really fascinating about God is not the correspondence between his attack on Moses and his giving the promise, but the disjunction of them. In this way, God does not correspond with himself, but contradicts himself. Next, law and gospel distinguish between two divine words, not merely between two psychological human experiences or perspectives. So he's saying it's not just that the human experience differs from law to gospel. The difference is not in the human, it's not in me. Instead, God is united by law, is not united by law and gospel, but divided. Okay, let's see. Then he says, and the offense is not only that God died, it is that the cross is a contradiction for God. God does not correspond to himself when Christ is cursed upon the tree. He is not identical with himself. He is not united so that attributes can be attributed to him in proper simple form. I don't know how you can explain your way around this. Like, one or two of these, you say, okay, yeah, it's rhetorical devices to talk about vicarious atonement. This is not what he's saying. He's clearly going beyond it. Then he says, the real cosmic battle that wages, even in God himself, between God and God, there is no unity or mutual interpenetration between God's irrational jealousy and the rational ordering of the law. Next, God is the one who opposes the law with his new word that forgives without any care about the law. Ignores the law, just forgives. Law doesn't matter. All right. Thereby, the love of God triumphs over justice, as it is usually called, of God. And we find that these attributes, quote, are not balanced at all in God's eternal essence. God ceases being simple or one in the way that the Platonists like to put it. He's saying, I don't believe in divine simplicity over and over and over and over again. And people are going to be like, no, he doesn't really mean that. He means something else. It's just rhetoric. Okay, then he says, the great cosmic struggle is God's own and so is truly theological. That's after this. He's saying, Platonists are wrong. God is not simple. He is not one essence. And the great cosmic struggle of the gospel is God versus God. This is what Paulson does. He takes the gospel away from redemptive history because it's not for Christ to atone for our sins by satisfying the demands of the divine law. Instead, it's a battle within God's own eternal being that his gospel has to overcome his law so that he can forgive without the law at all. You have this Manichaean, two different aspects of God where the good graciousness of God has to overtake the wrathful part of God so that you can be forgiven without any law at all. Okay, then he says this. What happened to the idea that God was love and the greatest good that I could ever desire? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the whole point, okay? Who wants to have his goal in life to arrive at God against God? Reason is repelled by the thought that God could ever be against God. Where is the simplicity, unity, correspondence, or sense in that? So he's saying God is not. He is not the greatest good. He is not the greatest of all beings. He is not a one simple essence. He's not any of those things. He is not the eternal happiness that I long for. I'm going to keep going with these. This is... Okay, here's some from volume 2. There are a lot more of these too, but I'm just trying to make it as clear as possible because this is the most important point. So I'm trying to get a ton of quotes here. I know I'm over time here. I got to end, but okay. God's wonderful conflict with God means an impossible change for Jonah. Okay, got conflict with God. God changes his own heart from wrath to mercy. So there's this internal change within God himself. So that there is this battle between God, and this is the life of Jonah, but that God changes his heart because the merciful aspect of God overtakes the wrathful part of God. Then he says, God proceeds to oppose himself as unpreached, repenting while changing his heart in the most violent way. Strong rhetoric to say God changes his heart in the most violent way. He's rejecting divine immutability. Okay. Another quote, then the preacher is further clothed with the word that promises forgiveness to the undeserving sinner in full flight from God, hating Christ, despising the world, and united with the preacher in despising grace is the direct opposite of everything good, holy, loving, and beautiful in the world. Yet in this battle of God against God, God always wins, as Jonah attests. Then he goes on to, here's one where he just says he rejects the great tradition, which we're talking about the tradition of the entire church. When people talk about the great tradition, they're talking about the unity in Christianity, even amidst differences between Christian traditions, which I don't think are insignificant. But there is some kind of kernel of broader agreement among various Christian traditions on what the Christianity is. And he says, that is the great tradition of the Orthodox Church in a nutshell, and is the glue for Erasmus in the narrative of both the church and the world. So here he's rejecting Erasmus in the bondage of the will, and he's basically saying the great tradition idea is something that Erasmus agrees with, and we can throw out the great tradition. Then he says, does he have the great tradition in the whole church's history behind him? Free will is only the face of the secret cause of theodicy bubbling beneath the surface that is compelled to justify God in light of evil, suffering, and death. These three monsters present the case against God on the basis of law. If any of these were traceable to the one and only God, God would be found in violation of his own law. A God against God, and a divided house cannot stand. All right, that's what he says. Okay, those are the main points I wanted to hit. I got a bunch of other stuff here, just to be clear. Here is some stuff about the third use of the law. Here, you can always pause the video and read the quotes. More against the third use of the law. This is all very, very clear. There are times where he says that Jesus sins. He sins against the golden rule. He committed his own personal sin. Language that he has not actually ever retracted. But people say he didn't mean. And it very well could just be kind of rhetorical device, but certainly not a helpful one. And if that's the case, he certainly should probably make some kind of statement that he doesn't actually believe Jesus sinned in some public forum somewhere, because as far as I know, he never has. All right, I think that's enough. I'm not dealing with this again. I just want you to know this is where Paulson's at. I've read enough of the guy. I don't want to read anymore. I just get frustrated about this stuff, and I've written enough on it. I've said my piece. You could say I'm just totally misrepresenting everything that he's saying, and maybe he doesn't mean anything that he says, and maybe all of this is totally perfectly orthodox, and I'm crazy. Anyway, make sure you subscribe, like this, and subscribe on YouTube and in your podcast app, and hopefully in the next time we'll be discussing something more fun, and we'll see you then. God bless.